Simon says subscribe and click on the bell icon to receive notifications.
As we've already mentioned a few times already in this course, an Access database by default is a single file. And that can create a number of problems that we're going to review in this lesson. Now, some of these problems that we're going to discuss we can overcome by splitting the database into two parts, front end and back end. So in this lesson, we're going to explore why we might want to split an Access database. I'm then going to show you the process of splitting a database. We'll take a look at how we can protect the back end. And then we're going to talk about the importance of the location for the back end as well. So let's start out with that first question. Why split an Access database? Now, currently, we're looking at the latest version of the Night Movies database. And you'll find this file in the Course Files folder, and it's basically a copy of the completed Exercise 1 file. And if you take a look over on the left, we have all of our objects grouped. So we have our tables at the top, then we have our queries, our forms, our reports, and our macros. Now, it might be that this database is stored in a shared network location, and we might have several users that are going to access the database. Now remember, currently, our database is all in one file. Now, the more people that access this database, the higher the chance is that it's going to be damaged, maybe through some kind of network glitch or some other hardware error that might cause damage to the file. Now, rather helpfully, there isn't really any reason why users shouldn't have their own copy of parts of this database. For example, a user might have their own copy of all of the forms in the database, or maybe all of the queries. Now, of course, we would need to make sure that we have some kind of process in place so that everything is kept up to date. But there is one thing that you can't have your own copy of, and that is the data. The data must always be shared. So in general terms, the UI components don't have to be shared, but the data does. So we could split the database into two parts and put the shared data into the back end and put the non-shared UI components, so things like forms, into the front end. Let's take a look at another reason for splitting a database. Now, let's suppose this database is in a network location and we have 10 people using it from different PC locations. When one of those users wants to view or amend data, they load a form. That form has to travel across a network and they load the data for the form. Maybe they change some data or maybe run a report, but everything they do involves network traffic. If you split the database so that the back end is in the shared location and the front end is on the user's PC, only the data part generates network traffic. So as each user is just loading forms on their local device that reside on their local device, you're going to reduce the amount of traffic. Now, another factor that's also very important is security is a lot easier to organize if you have a database that is split into front end and back end. So when it comes to establishing security, the way that you do it for the back end, the data part, is quite different from the way that you do it for the front end. And that links nicely into my next point, which is that if you have users that want to create their own reports or design their own forms, it's much easier to manage if those users have their own front end. So if someone is creating their own forms and reports, rather than putting them into a central location where they might clutter up the database for other users, those custom elements they can keep to themselves in their own copy of the front end database. So with all that said, let's take a look at the process for splitting a database up into front end and back end. And what we're going to do is we're going to create our own new small database to demonstrate this. So we're going to create an asset tracking database. And notice that I'm currently in the new section, so File New, and we're going to use one of Access's templates. And it's this one here, Asset Tracking. If you don't have it at the top here like I do, you can just search for it down here by typing Asset Tracking into the search bar. So let's click to open this up. I'm going to give my file a name. Now I'm just going to put mine on the desktop for the time being. I will move this into the Course Files folder so that you can access this file if you need to. So let's click on Create. Now notice as soon as we do that, we get this welcome screen pop up. And we are going to talk a bit more about welcome screens a bit later on. Another thing to note on this welcome screen is that in the bottom corner, you do have a little link here called Get Started, and this will take you into some Really useful help files. And I always recommend that you do have a quick look at some of the videos available. Now, for the moment, we're just going to close this welcome screen. And what you'll see at the top here, if we take a look in the navigation pane, you can see that we have 4 tables in this template: assets, contacts, filters, and settings. Now, it's worth pointing out at this stage, if you are going to split a database, you should always take a backup of the database before the split. So in case anything goes wrong, you do have a backup. So I recommend saving off this file in its current state to a different location under a different file name before you start to do this. Now, the next thing you need to make sure is that you have everything closed. So we want to make sure we have all of our tables closed by clicking on the cross. Now, the process for splitting is actually really simple. If we go up to Database Tools, and in the Move Data group, we want to select the Access Database option. And this is going to take us into the Database Splitter. So you can see here it says, this wizard moves tables from your current database to a new backend database. So that sounds like exactly what we want. In multi-user environments, this reduces network traffic and allows continuous front-end development without affecting data or interrupting users. If your database is protected with a password, the new backend database will be created without a password and will be accessible to all users. So an important point just there. And you will need to add a password to the backend database after it is split. It then says it could be a long process. Make sure you make a backup copy of your database before splitting it. So worth reading through these paragraphs. We're going to say split database. I'm going to navigate to the folder where I want these saved. So again, I'm just going to save into the course files folder. And notice the default file name that's been assigned for the backend has had BE added to it. So this is how we can tell that this is the backend part of the database. So I'm happy with that file name. Let's click on Split. And there we go. It is done. So now notice something that's changed in the navigation pane. Next to each one of our tables, we now have that little blue arrow because these are now effectively linked tables. They're located in a different file because these are all part of the backend. Now, the location of that backend database is very important because it needs to be in a shared location so that any user that needs access to that data can do so. So in this lesson, I've shared mine into the course files folder in OneDrive, but in a real world scenario, you might want to save that to some kind of network drive or shared location within your team. In the previous lesson, we saw how we can split a database into front-end and back-end. And currently, we're looking at the front end. Now, there are consequences of this split, which we're going to talk about in this section. So we're going to start out by talking about shared and local tables. We'll then talk about backing up local data, saving in compiled format, moving the back-end database, and trusting a database location. Now, currently, there are 4 tables in this database, and they're all now linked tables because we moved them into a backend file. So what we're seeing here is a link to that file. Now, if we double click to open the settings table, notice that this table is a little bit different from some of the others. This table has one single record, and it has 2 fields, ID and show welcome. Now, the purpose of this table is that this is what controls the welcome screen. And this determines if that welcome screen is shown when we open the file. If you recall, when we open up this asset tracking database, we always get that welcome screen pop up. Now it pops up because we have a little tick in this box just here underneath the show welcome column. Now you can also set the welcome screen to pop up in the actual design of your database, but the other option is that each user should have one of these records so each user can choose if they want to see the welcome screen. And we're going to have a look at how this works more a little bit later on. Now at the moment, rather than having this record shared, each user should have their own version of this record and this table. So this table should be local to them, not shared. So currently this sits in the back end, which is shared data. We want to move this to the front end so the user has control. So given that we have this shared table and we need to convert it back to a local table, you'll be pleased to hear that this is a very simple thing to do in Access 2021. What we need to do is just close down settings, right click on Settings from the navigation pane, and right at the bottom we have an option in here, Convert to Local Table. Notice what happens as soon as I do that. We no longer have the little blue arrow next to it because this is no longer a linked table. It no longer resides in the back end. We've moved it to the front end. We might also want to let users set up their own local data. Maybe they're developing their own add-ons, forms, things like that. You can let your users set up their own local tables. And it is completely normal for users to have access to both local and shared data. Now, if users do have local data in their front-end databases, you need to consider this when it comes to backing up data. You need to include the front-end database as well as the back-end. Now, there is a facility in Access whereby we can save a database in compiled format. So if you've just split an Access database, you can save the front end in compiled format. Now, the reason why you might want to do that is that it improves the general performance of the database. It makes it quicker and also smaller because any program code is pre-compiled so it runs quickly. There are also security advantages of doing this. For example, users won't be able to modify the forms in the database. So we can save the database in compiled format and use the ACDE file extension. And in this compiled form, the program code is all in compiled form and can't be edited, but users can, however, create and modify tables and queries. So let's save our database in ACDE format. So we're going to jump up to File, down to Save As, and notice one of the options that we have in here is this one, Make ACCDE. So this file will be compiled to an executable file only. So we're going to choose this one, Save As. I'm going to save it into the Course Files folder again. Check out the file extension, ACDE. Click on Save. So now we've saved that, I'm just going to close down this welcome screen and we're going to close down the file completely. Now, if we look at this file in File Explorer and compare it to the originals, you can see here is the ACDE one at the bottom, and then just above we have the ACDB version. If you take a look at the size, you can see that the ACDE file is a lot smaller than the ACDB. Exactly the same file, but the DE file is compiled format. So the database is going to be able to do the same things, but what the users can do will be limited. So let's take a look at that. We're going to double click to open the ACDE version of this file. Now notice here we have the asset list form open. Now if I wanted to switch to the form's design view and make some changes, let's try and do that. I'm going to right click. Notice that we don't have design view in here. It's effectively disabled. Let's close this down and let's try and open something else. So let's take a look at a report. Let's say asset details, for example. If we open this up, we can see the report in report view. If I want to change the design, right click, I don't have that option in here. So you can start to see some of those restrictions when you save your file as an ACDE file. Now, there might be other things that you want to restrict. For example, maybe you don't want users to be able to see the navigation pane, for example. You can definitely do that, and it is going to be something that we'll look at later on. Now, there might come a point in time where you need to move the backend database. And I would think that this is fairly obvious. That's probably going to cause us problems if the location of that backend database changes. So let's take a look at the type of problems we might get if that scenario occurs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Course Files folder and I'm going to move the backend database. So there is the backend. What I'm going to do is quickly just create a new folder. And I'm just going to call this backend. And let's just very quickly move our backend file into this folder. So let's put it in there. Let's close down this file and let's reopen it. So it's this one just here, tracking 02. Notice we get an error message, could not find the file. And then we have the file path name and that backend database file. If I click on OK just here, we're going to start getting all kinds of error messages and I won't be able to access anything that's in the backend. So if I try and open some of these backend tables, it's not going to work. So if that does happen, if we have moved the backend and it starts causing problems with our files, we just need to relink to the backend. And we've seen how to do this before in previous lessons. We can use the linked table manager. So let's go up to External Data, open up Linked Table Manager. This is our backend file, so let's make sure that we select it. We can choose Relink, and then we can go into our subfolder, which is the new location, select it, click on OK, confirm, close this down, and then we should be back to normal, which we are. So that is pretty much how you move a backend database. Now I'm going to go and move it back to its original location, and I will see you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit further about how we can address multi-user issues. And we've referred a number of times in this course to data being shared between different users. And whilst we've been looking at putting in place mechanisms to do this, there are issues that arise when users share data, or what we call the multi-user aspects of sharing data. For example, let's suppose you locate a record in a database and are considering making changes to that record. But at the same time, another user in a different location accesses the same record. So either of us could make a change that has the potential to affect the other person's change. Or, whilst one of us is looking at a record, another person might be changing it so that the data that we're looking at is now out of date. So these multi-use issues are handled in Access using a number of different tools and techniques. So what we're going to look at in this lesson are issues when users share data. We're going to take a look at some advanced client settings. We're going to talk about default record locking, record level locking, and of course, we're going to demonstrate record locking. Now, one of the most important things to look at when thinking about this is the balance between the size of the database and the number of users and the level of churn. And when I say churn, that just refers to the amount that the data is changing. So maybe you have a very large database with a large number of users, but the level of churn is low. If that is the case, you can approach the issue of change in a very different way to one where the level of churn is high. Because a database with a low level of churn, you can take the approach that when one user is making a change, everybody else is locked out of that record. Whereas if you have a high level of churn, so lots of users and lots of changes happening all the time, it's going to be frustrating for those users if they are consistently locked out of records that they're trying to update. So in that situation, it's a lot more practical to let other users see a record that is potentially going to be changed. So when you're considering your approach to multi-user access, you need to take these factors into account. Now let's move on to talking about advanced client settings. Now we access our client settings by going into File and into Options, Client Settings, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom of this window, you can see we have some advanced client settings just here. And you can see that one of the options that we can change is the default open mode. We have two options, shared and exclusive. Now, almost without exception, this will be set to shared by default. Now, there are some situations where you might need to open in exclusive mode. And this is usually due to a maintenance requirement where you need exclusive access. And what we mean by exclusive access is that everybody else is locked out of the database. So if you need to perform some maintenance on a record or a table or something like that, you could set this to open in exclusive mode and you know that you're the only one in there and nobody else is currently trying to make changes to the database. So don't forget about that little option in there. Now I'm going to close down this file and we're just going to open up the A02 version of our CRM database. Because what we can do is we can also open a database in exclusive mode. Now, unfortunately, you can't open in exclusive mode if you're just selecting your file from your recent files list just here. You would need to go into Open and then browse for it in order to be able to see that Open in Exclusive option. So there is the file I want to open, the CRM A02, and if we go to the drop down next to Open, notice we have an option here to Open Exclusive. So if I was to choose this, it's going to open up the database and it's essentially going to lock everybody else out of the database. So it means that I can perform my maintenance task, I can update what I need to update, and I'm not going to have people getting in the way of that. Of course, the downside to this is that anybody else is trying to access the database is currently locked out until I've finished what I'm doing. And if you are working on a database with a high churn rate, so lots of people going in all the time making lots of updates, that can become quite frustrating for your users. So let's take a look at a couple of other options that we have. And for this, we're going to jump back into File, go down into Options, and go back to our Advanced Client Settings section. Now, notice here we have a little section called Default Record Locking, and we have three options: No Locks, All Records, and Edited Record. Now, the first option means that we do not, by default, lock a record. So if a user is viewing and changing a record, it doesn't lock anyone else out. Now, this sounds a little bit dangerous, but this is the option that is usually used in situations where there is little chance of two or more users changing the same record at the same time. So you might use this option when primarily users are adding data to a database and there aren't really that many situations where the data gets regularly changed and the chances of conflict are small. The next option, All Records, this applies to tables, and when you apply an all record lock, all of the records in the table are locked. So this is sometimes used as kind of a halfway house to do maintenance. So for example, if you need to do maintenance on a table, let's say maybe the records need new fields added, but you don't want to lock people out of the database altogether, you can use All Records. And then the final option here is Edited Record. So this means that when a user selects a record and opens a record to potentially make changes, only that record is locked. So this is a safer way of doing updates, but again, it can be frustrating if the record is left open in a locked status. There's been many situations that I've come across where somebody has opened a record in this mode to make their changes, and then has gone off to a meeting and left the record open in locked mode, which means nobody else can access that record. So just be aware of that if you're going to use this option. Now, notice underneath we have an option that says Open Databases by using Record Level Locking. And currently we have a check next to that. So this is really an alternative to locking individual records. But one thing you need to be aware of is that this refers to page level locking. Now, the records in a database are accessed using pages of data, and a page can have many records in it. So if you're doing edited record locking and you're asking access to lock individual records, if you uncheck this box, you are actually locking the page that this record is in. So this means you might be locking other records around that record as well. Now, the reason why you might do this is due to performance issues. Locking pages is much quicker for access to do. So sometimes switching from record level locking to page level locking can make performance a little bit better. Now, whilst we're on this page, let's take a look at some of these numbers that we have underneath that option. You can see that the refresh interval is set to 60 seconds. So this is the interval in which data will be refreshed for you by Access. So if someone has made a change to the data, then that will be refreshed minute by minute. And of course, you can adjust this if you need to. Now, let's talk a little bit further about record locking. So I've reopened up the Night Movies database. We're working in the 6.03 version that you'll find in section 6 of the course files folder. And I've just opened the navigation form in Design View. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that this has been split into Frontend and Backend. If you take a look at the tables, you can see that they have that little blue arrow next to them, which tells me that those are linked tables that are possibly stored off in a shared network location, therefore are in the backend, whereas the queries, forms, reports, and macros are all in the front end. Now, if we take a quick look at the property sheet for this particular form, and if we go across to the data tab, notice right at the bottom where it says record locks, it's set to edited record. Now, we do have a little drop down here, which is going to give us those three options that we were looking at in Access Options earlier: no locks, all records, and edited record. Now, I'm going to keep this on edited record because what this effectively means is that if I had this form, and remember this form is in the front end, if I had this form open on my PC as I do now, and then my colleague down the corridor also opens their navigation form on their PC and tries to edit the same record that I'm currently editing, I'm not going to be able to do that. So for example, if we go back into form view, you can see this is my movie maintenance form. If I was trying to change the year of release here from, let's say, 1994 to 1993, which I realize is wrong, but let's just take that as our example. If I was trying to change this record just here, and somebody else on another PC was also trying to change it, when I try and click away, I'm going to get an error message letting me know that this record is locked. So it's basically not going to let me update or save the record until the other user moves away from that field. So just be aware of that and make sure you fully understand what each of those three options mean when it comes to record locking.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To see the full course that this video came from, click over there. And click over there to see more videos from Simon Says It.